official in Kurdistan warns the threat from the self-styled Islamic militants could quickly spread to the west.
It's a much more aggressive, more merciless, brutal system. And I say again, this is the front on the war on terrorism. And if we don't stop this here, they will come for the West. They'll come for England, they'll come for Europe, they'll come for the United States. They need to be stopped, and they need to be stopped decisively.
Well, the coalition partners have been negotiating on their anti-terror measures within the last 24 hours. The areas they're thought to agree on are intelligence agencies being given more access to airline information, the stripping of terror suspects' passports so they can't travel, and compulsory de-radicalisation programmes. The problem areas are thought to be the prevention of terror suspects who are British citizens returning to the UK. This appears to be a legal problem as much as a political one. There's also thought to be disagreement over the relocation of suspects within the UK.
Well, we're joined from our central London studio by John Rees, who's National Officer at the Stop the War Coalition. He thinks the government must take action to combat the terror threat to the UK. And Alan Mendoza is the Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society. He also joins us from central London and believes that the government are already on the right path. John Rees, let's bring you in first. The government clearly has to do something to combat the threat of fighters from the UK going to the Middle East and also those who've been radicalised returning. What do you think they should be doing?
Well, I think they have very many of the tools that they need in place. I mean, let's be clear about this threat. It is nothing on the scale of the threat that the country faced from the IRA. Nobody has blown up the cabinet in a hotel in Brighton. Nobody has lobbed a mortar into the back garden of 10 Downing Street. And we have a raft of terror legislation already on the books. We're supposed to be standing up for the values of a democratic society. Now, if people have done something wrong, if they've committed a crime, they should be put before a court, they should be tried by 12 of their peers, and if they've committed the crime, they should be found guilty. Those laws already exist, and what David Cameron is doing is he's playing pre-election politics with this issue. The question of, for instance, of removing people's passport was first raised by Nigel Farage of UKIP, then Nick Clegg jumped on the bandwagon, Cameron's jumped on the bandwagon, and I think it's very interesting that a figure like Paddy Ashdown, who I don't normally agree with, but who says, look, this has gone too far, this is knee-jerk response, and I think that's absolutely right.
I mean, I think it's interesting that you bring up that they are a lesser threat than the IRA. Think of events like the 7th of July attack in the UK. Think of the killing of Lee Rigby. Let's bring in Alan Mendoza. Do you think this is a fair point that John is making, that the government is simply using this as a bit of a vote winner?
Well, I think the IRA point, firstly, is a ridiculous one to make. Firstly, the IRA grew in strength over time in terms of the spectacular attacks it did. It didn't start doing those in the 1970s in London the same way it did by the 80s and 90s. Secondly, there wasn't a body of massive sympathy for the IRA within the UK. There is a potential for that to happen here, unfortunately, with groups of young men going overseas to fight jihad and then coming back afterwards. I think the two situations are certainly not analogous, and you need to be very careful about making that point. But I do think in more general terms, what we're seeing is not knee-jerk reactions from the government as such, but actually a path that we've seen trodden carefully by governments over the last 10 years, understanding the threat they are facing on a greater level and taking action accordingly. I mean, this government has already started to put things into place from the Lee Rigby killing last year. Now we're seeing obviously the threat from jihadists coming back. I think it's right to take further action accordingly.
John Rees, what do you think are the root causes of any potential terror threat to the UK?
Well, I think the root causes are the Western policy that's been now 13 years in the war on terror in the Middle East itself. And let's be clear, if we want really to deal with the threat of ISIS, there are measures that this government should be taking, which they're certainly not taking, serious measures. Everybody knows that ISIS is running oil tankers from the territory that they hold over the Turkish border, selling the oil on the international black market and getting funds for their terror activities. Now, why is there not, at the NATO summit this weekend, a special meeting with Turkey, which is a NATO ally, and say, stop this happening? Why are we putting up with a situation where ISIS is being funded by the Saudis and the Qataris, and we're not saying to these people, this is outrageous. You are actually funding a terrorist organisation. You're supposed to be a Western ally. This country trades billions of pounds of arms with Saudi Arabia. That's going to stop if you don't put your house in order. Now, these would be serious diplomatic measures aimed at draining the swamp swamp out of which ISIS grows, but they're not being taken. This stuff that we're talking about, this stuff is, to be honest, not going to deal with the fundamental causes of the problem whatsoever.
Alan Mendoza, you were nodding your head during that. I mean, do you think those are fair points, that the government should be doing more, and in fact, it could potentially be a lot more effective if they did more on the international stage rather than looking at domestic measures?
Now, I agree with the point about having to stop the supply side, if you like, in terms of what's happening with ISIS and sale of oil and other such activities. I think we can certainly do more there. But there is also a demand side problem in this country as well, and that's what the government has to look out for as well in its security measures. And I come back to this point, it's raised all the time that foreign policy is to blame for this, as the root cause. This is nonsense. Let me tell you, in the 1990s, when we were not intervening in Bosnia, Islamists used that as an excuse to radicalise people. Then, when we did intervene in Kosovo, they used that. Then we intervened in Iraq, they used that. Then we didn't intervene in Syria, they used that. In other words, they use whatever they can, whatever false excuse they can, to drive their poisonous and dangerous ideology in order to take advantage of young people who don't know any better to join their cause.
I'm afraid we're out of time. Alan Mendoza and John Rees, thank you both very much.
Well, now, a survey for Sky News has found that just 8%